The chapel smelled like old wood and lilies. I stood near the back wall, hands clasped in front of me, watching the rows of dress uniforms and civilian suits fill the pews. Outside, the November wind rattled the stained glass windows. Inside, everyone spoke in hushed tones that barely rose above the organ music. My brother's memorial service. I'd flown in from North Carolina the night before, caught a few hours of sleep in a hotel room, and showed up in the only suit I owned. It was black, simple, purchased years ago for occasions exactly like this one. I didn't own many civilian clothes anymore. The family occupied the first 3 rows. Aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't seen in a decade. My mother sat in the front pew, her shoulders trembling beneath a black shawl. And beside her, rigid as iron, sat my father. He hadn't looked at me when I walked in. I found a spot along the side wall where I could see everything but remain apart. That felt right. I'd been apart from this family for so long that standing with them now would have felt like a lie. The service proceeded in the way these things do. A pastor spoke about loss and faith. My brother's college roommate told a story about a road trip to Austin. An old coach talked about his high school football days. Each speaker painted a picture of a life well lived, a man beloved, a son who made his family proud. Then my father stood. He moved slowly to the podium, his back straight despite his 73 years. He'd been a machinist for 40 years, a man who built things with his hands and believed in tangible results. He adjusted the microphone with a sharp metallic scrape that echoed through the chapel. "My son was a good man," he began, his voice rough with grief. "He worked hard. He built a business. He had a wife, 2 daughters. He contributed something to this world." I felt the words like a hand pressing against my chest. "He made me proud," my father continued. "He understood what it meant to be a man, to provide, to build something that lasts." His eyes scanned the crowd, passing over faces, landing briefly on mine. Something cold flickered there. "I had 2 sons," he said, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. One of them understood responsibility. One of them understood family. The organ music had stopped. The only sound was the wind against the windows. The other... He paused, and that pause stretched out like a wire pulled taut. The other chose to run away, to abandon his family for some uniform and a paycheck, to disappear into a life that meant nothing to anyone here. Whispers rippled through the pews. Heads turned. Eyes found me against the wall. "I see him standing back there," my father said, his voice hardening. "Showing up after years of silence, thinking he has a right to be here, thinking we forgot about him." My mother's shoulders shook harder. My aunt reached over to grip her hand. "I want everyone here to know," my father said, his words falling like stones, "that I have 1 son I'm proud of, and 1 son who's a shame to this family, and we all know which is which." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of 100 held breaths, of shock and discomfort, and the terrible weight of public cruelty. I felt every eye on me, felt the heat of judgment and pity and something worse. Agreement. I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't defend myself. I stood there against the wall with my hands still clasped in front of me, my face carefully neutral. And I absorbed every word like I'd been trained to absorb worse things in worse places. My father returned to his seat. The pastor stepped forward, struggling to find words to bridge the moment, to smooth over what couldn't be smoothed. The service continued, but I barely heard it. I stayed because leaving would have proven him right. I stayed because my brother deserved that much. But inside, in a place I'd learned to keep very quiet, I made a decision. I would not explain myself. Not here. Not to him. Not to anyone. Some things didn't need to be said. I was 7 the first time I realized my father had a favorite. We'd been in the backyard, my brother and me, throwing a football back and forth. David was 12, already strong, already showing the athletic ability that would carry him through high school. I dropped the ball more often than I caught it, my hands too small, my coordination all wrong. My father had been watching from the porch, beer in hand. "David's got it," he'd said to my mother. "That one's got what it takes." He hadn't said anything about me. The pattern established itself early and never changed. David excelled at sports, football, baseball, basketball. I preferred books and drawing and asking questions that irritated my father. David knew how to fix cars and work with his hands. I could barely change a tire. David dated the popular girls and talked about business and success. I talked about places I wanted to see and things I wanted to understand. "You think too much," my father told me once. "Thinking doesn't build anything." By high school, the divide was absolute. David got the attention, the praise, the investment. I got tolerance. My father came to every one of David's games. He came to exactly none of my academic competitions. When David got into state college on a partial football scholarship, my father threw a party. When I got accepted to 3 universities with full academic rides, he asked which one was cheapest. I chose none of them. At 18, 2 weeks after graduation, I walked into a recruiting office. My mother cried. David looked confused. My father said, "You're throwing your life away." "I'm finding my own path," I told him. "There's no path in the military," he said. "There's just taking orders and wasting time. You could go to college. You could make something of yourself." "Maybe I will." "Not like this," he said. "This is what people do when they don't have better options." I shipped out to basic training in July. My mother sent letters every week. David sent one. My father sent nothing. I threw myself into training with an intensity that surprised me. Every morning run, every drill, every impossible standard, I met it. The discipline felt like relief. The structure felt like freedom. For the first time in my life, I was judged on what I did, not on who my brother was. I called home 3 times during those first 2 years. Short conversations, awkward silences. My mother asking if I was eating enough. David talking about his new job at a construction firm. My father in the background, saying nothing. The 4th time I called, I mentioned I'd been selected for specialized training. I didn't say what kind, I couldn't, but I wanted them to know I was doing well. "Specialized in what?" my father asked, the first words he'd spoken to me in months. "I can't really talk about it. Can't or won't. Can't." He made a sound that might have been a laugh or a grunt. "Secret soldier now. Too important to tell your own father what you do." "It's not like that." "It's exactly like that. You left this family for something you can't even explain. Something that doesn't mean anything to anyone here. It means something to me." "Then I guess that's enough for you," he said, and handed the phone back to my mother. After that, the calls became less frequent. Then, rare. Then, they stopped altogether. I told myself it was easier this way. I was overseas half the time anyway, in places I couldn't name, doing things I couldn't discuss. I built a different kind of family with the men and women I served with. We understood each other in ways civilians never could. But sometimes, late at night in a barracks or a tent or a transport plane, I'd think about my father's voice saying, "Shame to this family." And I'd wonder if he'd been right all along. Maybe I had run away. Maybe I'd chosen the uniform because it was easier than trying to compete with the son he actually wanted. Or maybe, and this was the thought I circled back to most often, maybe I'd finally found a place where my own worth wasn't measured against someone else's shadow. I didn't go home for Christmas that first year, or the second, or the 5th. There were always missions, always deployments, always reasons. Good reasons, real reasons, but also easier reasons. By the time David got married, I was in a place I definitely couldn't leave. I sent a card. My mother called to tell me about the wedding, about the grandchildren she hoped for, about how much David's business was growing. She didn't ask when I was coming home. She'd learned not to. The memorial service ended with a hymn I didn't know the words to. People filed out slowly, stopping to embrace my mother, to shake my father's hand, to offer condolences that all sounded the same. I stayed against the wall, waiting for the crowd to thin. Several people glanced at me as they passed. A few nodded. Most looked away quickly, uncomfortable with acknowledging the son who'd just been publicly disowned. My Aunt Sarah approached, her eyes red. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "He's grieving. He doesn't mean—" "It's fine," I said. "It's not fine." What he said was cruel. He said what he's always thought. At least now it's out in the open. She squeezed my arm and moved on. The chapel slowly emptied. My mother stood near the front, surrounded by a protective circle of relatives. My father had stepped outside. Through the windows, I could see him on the front steps, accepting sympathies from a line of mourners. I should have left then. Should have walked out the back door, caught a cab to the airport, returned to the life I'd built far away from this. But something kept me rooted there. Maybe it was respect for my brother. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe I just wanted to see if my father would say one more thing, cross one more line. "Excuse me." The voice came from my left. I turned to see a man in an army dress uniform, his chest decorated with ribbons I recognized. A colonel. Late 50s, silver hair, sharp eyes that assessed me the way officers assessed everyone. "Yes, sir," I said automatically. He studied me for a moment. "You're the brother." "I am. I served with David briefly, years ago. Different units, but we crossed paths. He spoke about you sometimes." That surprised me. "He did?" "He was proud of you," the colonel said. "Though he said you two didn't talk much?" "We didn't." The colonel nodded slowly. "I heard what your father said. I want you to know that was out of line. It's a difficult day for everyone. Difficult doesn't excuse cruelty." He paused, his eyes moving past me to where my father was still holding court outside. Some men never learn to see what's right in front of them. Before I could respond, he moved toward the exit. But he didn't leave immediately. Instead, he stopped to speak with another officer I hadn't noticed, a younger man holding a thin folder. They exchanged quiet words. The younger officer glanced at me, then back at the colonel. Something passed between them. A decision made. I didn't think much of it then. The reception was held at my parents' house, the same house I'd grown up in. The living room where I'd played as a child now held folding tables covered with casseroles and desserts. The walls were decorated with family photos, mostly of David. His wedding, his graduation, his daughters. A few of me existed, buried in older frames, but they might as well have been invisible. I stood in the kitchen, drinking coffee, watching through the doorway as my father accepted condolences like a politician at a fundraiser. He'd changed into a casual shirt, his face composed, his grief apparently boxed up and stored away for private moments. My mother found me there. She looked smaller than I remembered, worn down by loss and years. "I'm glad you came," she said quietly. "Of course I came. Your father, he's not himself right now. Mom, he's exactly himself. He just said it out loud this time." Her eyes filled with tears. "He loves you. He's just never known how to show it. Love that looks like contempt isn't love." "Don't say that." "Why not? It's true." She touched my arm, her hand trembling. "Please don't leave angry. Not today. Not after everything." I set down my coffee. "I'm not angry. I'm tired. I'm tired of being the son who's never enough. The one who made the wrong choices. The shame." "You're not a shame," she whispered. "He said I was. In front of everyone. At my brother's memorial. He's hurting." "So am I," I said more sharply than I intended. "David was my brother too." Before she could respond, my father's voice cut through the low conversation in the living room. "I want to thank everyone for coming today," he said, his voice carrying that same authority he'd always had, the kind that commanded rooms and silenced questions. David would have been touched by this turnout. He had so many friends, so much respect in this community. He built something real here, something that mattered. I felt my jaw tighten. "That's what a man does," my father continued. "He plants roots. He creates something lasting. He doesn't run from responsibility or hide behind excuses about duty and service." Several people glanced toward the kitchen. They knew who he was talking about. "A real man stays," my father said. "He fights for his family, not for strangers halfway around the world." My mother's hand tightened on my arm. "Please," she whispered, "don't engage. Not here." I wasn't planning to. I'd learned a long time ago that some battles couldn't be won with words. Some people would never see you differently, no matter what you said or did. But then the front door opened. The colonel stepped inside, the younger officer with the folder behind him. The room quieted as they entered, their uniforms immediately commanding attention and respect. My father's expression shifted, confusion replacing certainty. The colonel's eyes found mine across the room. He gave a small nod, and I realized something was about to happen that I hadn't anticipated, couldn't control, and probably couldn't stop. The colonel moved through the crowd with the kind of purpose that made people step aside instinctively. Conversations died. The younger officer followed, holding the folder against his chest like it contained something sacred. My father straightened, clearly trying to understand why two army officers had entered his home uninvited during a private reception. "Can I help you?" my father asked, his tone somewhere between confusion and territorial irritation. "Mr. Harrison," the colonel said, extending his hand. "Colonel James Mitchell. I apologize for the intrusion. I know this is a difficult time." My father shook his hand warily. "Did you know David?" "Briefly, years ago. But I'm not here about David." The colonel turned, his eyes finding me in the kitchen doorway. "I'm here about your other son." The room went completely still. My father's face hardened. "I don't see how that's any of your business." "Normally, it wouldn't be," Colonel Mitchell said calmly. "Normally, a man's service record is his own business. But I was at the memorial this morning. I heard what you said. And I think there are some things you need to understand about the son you just called a shame." "Colonel, this is a private family matter," my father said, his voice rising slightly. "I don't need the army showing up to—" "With respect, sir, you made it public when you humiliated him in front of a chapel full of people." The colonel's tone remained level, but there was steel underneath. "You accused him of abandoning his family, of choosing a meaningless life, of being worth less than your other son." "That's not—" "I didn't say—" "You said exactly that. I was there." Colonel Mitchell gestured to the younger officer, who stepped forward and opened the folder. "This is your son's service record. Portions of it, anyway. Much of what he's done remains classified, but I've compiled what I can legally share. I think you should hear it." "I don't need to hear anything," my father said, but his voice lacked conviction now. He looked around the room, seeing the faces of relatives and friends all watching, waiting. "Then listen for them," the colonel said, nodding toward the crowd. "They deserve to know the truth about the man you degraded this morning." He took the folder from the younger officer and began to read. "Your son enlisted at 18 and completed basic training at the top of his class. He was selected for advanced infantry training and then for Ranger School, which has a 60% failure rate. He passed on his first attempt." My father's mouth opened, then closed. "At 22, he deployed to Afghanistan as part of a special operations unit. He spent 18 months in combat zones, participating in operations I cannot detail. He received a Bronze Star for valor after his team was ambushed, and he provided covering fire that allowed 7 wounded soldiers to be evacuated." Someone in the living room gasped softly. "He redeployed twice more," Colonel Mitchell continued. "Each time volunteering, each time taking on assignments that other soldiers refused. He served in Iraq, Syria, and places I'm not at liberty to name. He's been awarded 2 Purple Hearts for injuries sustained in combat." My mother's hand flew to her mouth. She'd never known. I'd never told her. "At 28, he was selected for an elite unit conducting high-risk operations. He served with distinction for 4 years. During that time, he completed missions that prevented attacks on American soil, rescued hostages, and eliminated threats to national security." The colonel's voice remained steady, professional, but I could hear something else underneath. Respect, maybe even reverence. He was promoted to Master Sergeant at 31, making him one of the youngest to achieve that rank in his unit. His commanding officers describe him as exceptionally skilled, utterly reliable, and possessed of the kind of courage that can't be taught. Colonel Mitchell looked up from the folder, his eyes moving from my father to me and back again. 2 years ago, your son was leading a team on a classified operation when they encountered a situation that went sideways. There was an IED, an improvised explosive device. He saw it before anyone else, had maybe 2 seconds to react. He could have hit the ground, protected himself. Instead, he pushed 2 of his men out of the blast radius. The silence in the room was absolute. The explosion caught him anyway. Shrapnel in his left leg and back. Severe concussion. He was medevaced out and spent 3 months in recovery. Doctors told him he'd probably never return to active duty. He was offered a medical discharge with full benefits and a disability rating. Colonel Mitchell closed the folder. He refused. He completed physical therapy, passed every fitness test, and returned to his unit. He served another year before taking a training position at Fort Bragg, where he currently helps prepare the next generation of soldiers for the same kind of work he did. My father stood frozen, his face drained of color. "So when you call your son a shame," Colonel Mitchell said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "When you say he abandoned his family and chose a meaningless life, when you claim he ran away from responsibility, I want you to understand something very clearly." He took a step closer to my father. "Your son has spent the last 15 years serving this country with a level of commitment and sacrifice that most people can't even imagine. He's bled for it. He's nearly died for it. He's missed weddings and birthdays and funerals because he was halfway around the world keeping people like you safe enough to stand in your living room and insult him." The colonel's voice hardened just slightly. "He didn't run away from responsibility. He ran toward the hardest responsibility there is. And he's excelled at it in ways that would make any father proud, if that father had the wisdom to see it." He turned to me then, his expression softening. "Master Sergeant Harrison, it's an honor to serve alongside men like you." He saluted. I returned the salute automatically, my throat tight. The younger officer handed me the folder. "This is yours, Master Sergeant, a summary of your service, in case you ever need to remind anyone what you've accomplished." Then they were gone, leaving through the front door as purposefully as they'd entered. The silence they left behind felt like the aftermath of an explosion. My father stood in the center of his living room, surrounded by 50 witnesses to his humiliation, and for the first time in my life, he had nothing to say. His face had gone from pale to gray. His hands hung at his sides, useless. He looked like a man who'd just discovered the ground beneath him was never as solid as he'd believed. My mother moved first. She crossed the room to me, tears streaming down her face, and wrapped her arms around me in a way she hadn't since I was a child. "Why didn't you tell us?" she whispered against my shoulder. "Would it have mattered?" I asked quietly. She pulled back, her hands gripping my arms. "Of course it would have mattered." "I'm not sure it would have, not to him." We both looked at my father. He still hadn't moved. Around him, relatives and friends whispered to each other, shooting glances between us, uncertain how to process what had just happened. My Aunt Sarah was crying. My Uncle Tom looked stunned. David's wife stood near the back, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with something that might have been shame or shock or both. I gently extracted myself from my mother's embrace and walked toward my father. The crowd parted. When I stopped in front of him, he finally looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time in years. "I didn't do it for recognition," I said quietly, speaking only to him. "I didn't do it to prove you wrong, or to make you regret your words. I did it because it felt like the right path for me, the only path that made sense." His mouth worked, but no sound came out. "You wanted me to be like David," I continued. "To build a business, buy a house, settle down. Those are good things, honorable things. David was a good man, and I'm proud he was my brother. But that wasn't my path. I didn't know," my father managed finally. His voice was hoarse. "You never said—" "You never asked," I said, not unkindly. "In 15 years you never once asked me what I actually did. You assumed it was meaningless because it didn't look like the life you understood." He flinched, as if I'd struck him. "I'm not looking for an apology," I said. "I'm not even sure I'd know what to do with one. I came here because David was my brother, and I loved him, and I wanted to pay my respects. That's all." "I was wrong," my father said, and the words came out broken. "What I said this morning, what I've said all these years, I was wrong. Yes, you were. I thought you were running away. I thought you were choosing the easy way out, letting the military make your decisions for you." He shook his head slowly. "I didn't understand. I didn't even try to understand." "No, you didn't." He looked down at his hands, and for a moment I saw him as he truly was. An old man who'd lost one son and realized too late that he'd driven the other away. "Can you forgive me?" he asked. I thought about that question, thought about the years of silence and judgment, the comparisons and disappointments, the way I'd learned to measure my worth by the opinions of men who actually knew me rather than the one man whose opinion I'd once wanted most. "Maybe," I said finally, "but not today. Today I'm going to remember my brother. I'm going to say goodbye to him the way he deserved. And then I'm going back to my life. Will you—" He stopped, swallowed. "Will you come back? Sometime?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "I've built a different life. A good life. One that doesn't have much room for the person you always saw when you looked at me." "I want to know that person," he said. "The real person. The one I never tried to see." "Then maybe you should have looked while you had the chance." It wasn't cruelty that made me say it. It was truth. Sometimes truth is harder than cruelty because it can't be dismissed or argued with or forgotten. I turned to leave, and my mother caught my arm one more time. "I'm proud of you," she said. "I should have said it years ago. I should have said it every day. I'm proud of who you are and what you've done." "Thank you," I said, and meant it. I walked through the living room toward the front door. People stepped aside. A few reached out to touch my arm or shoulder, small gestures of respect or apology or understanding. I accepted them with nods. Outside, the November air felt clean and cold. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I stood on the front steps, the same steps where I'd waited for the school bus as a child, where I'd sat and read books while my father and brother worked on cars in the driveway, where I'd stood the morning I left for basic training and looked back one last time at a house that never quite felt like home. The folder was still in my hand. I looked down at it, at the summary of 15 years condensed into typed pages and official language. This wasn't who I was. It was what I'd done, but not who I'd become. I'd become someone who understood that shame wasn't about failing to meet someone else's expectations. It was about failing to meet your own, about choosing the easy path when a harder one called to you, about living a life that felt safe instead of a life that felt true. My father had called me a shame because I'd walked away from his vision of what a man should be, but I'd walked toward something else, toward challenge and sacrifice, and a kind of brotherhood he'd never understand, toward purpose. That wasn't shame. That was courage. I folded the folder and tucked it under my arm. Tomorrow I'd fly back to North Carolina, back to the base, the work, the men and women who understood what it meant to serve, back to a life that made sense to me in ways this place never had. But tonight, I'd remember my brother, not as the son my father preferred, but as the man he'd been, flawed and human and worthy of love. I'd remember the good moments we'd shared before distance and different paths pulled us apart. I'd forgive him for not understanding me, because understanding required a bridge neither of us had known how to build. And maybe someday I'd forgive my father too. But forgiveness would come on my terms, in my time, when I was ready, because I'd learned something important in 15 years of service, something my father had never understood. The strongest men aren't the ones who never bend. They're the ones who bend without breaking, who absorb the hits and keep moving forward, who know their worth doesn't depend on someone else's recognition. I walked down the steps toward my rental car, and I didn't look back. Behind me, in that house full of people who'd finally seen me, my father was learning what shame really meant. It meant realizing too late that the son you dismissed was the one who'd needed you most. It meant understanding that dignity and honor came in forms you'd never recognized. It meant discovering that you'd spent a lifetime looking for something in one son that was standing right in front of you in the other. That was his lesson to learn, not mine. I'd already learned mine.